Thanks for coming along tonight for our discussion on Australian politics after the 2023 New South Wales election. This was worked out some time ago, but I suppose you can also put in the Ashton by-election if our speakers wish to. So we've got two great speakers here tonight. I'll introduce them briefly. Who's going first, by the way? Aaron's going. First come goes first. Yeah. So Aaron Patrick is a senior correspondent for the Australian Financial Review. We see him occasionally on Sky News and elsewhere. Author of 5 books, 4 of them non-fiction, most recently Ego, on the Liberal Party and the lead up to and after the last election, with a focusing a fair bit on Malcolm Turnbull and others. And Parnell Palme McGuinness, who is Managing Director of Agenda C and also a columnist for the Sun Herald and the Sunday Age. And both our speakers have been here before, and they're both very welcome returning today. So we lead off with Aaron Patrick and then Parnell McGuinness, and on we go. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerard. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and thank for everyone who is out there online listening to us speak. I want to start with a little story about a press conference that Dominic Perrottet gave in January. It's the very start of the year, and I decided we're going to have an election this year, so I go down and watch him speaking at a press conference at the Sydney Fish Markets. And we were standing there all waiting, us journalists, and a young woman next to me introduced herself, and she said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm Aaron Patrick." And she looked blankly. I'm like, "Well, you don't know who I am?" I said, "Well, who are you?" And she said, "Well, I'm a student at Sydney University, and I'm doing an internship at Channel 7. And I said, "Oh, okay, well, welcome." The press conference started, and this young woman could not get Perrottet's attention. She kept putting her hand up, but they're quite aggressive things, and the other television journalists were too assertive for her. And it got to the very end of it, and Perrottet looked, and I put my hand up and looked over me, so he said, "Okay, Aaron, you can have the last question." And I said, "Premier, there was a student here from Sydney University who wants to ask a question." And Perrottet says, "That's the best university in the country. What is your name?" And she tells him, and he says, "Well, welcome, Laura," whatever her name was. "I bet you this is going to be the best question of the whole press conference." So she reads the phone to read the question that some producer in town had sent her to ask. And it was without doubt the most boring question of the whole press conference. And Perrottet said, "Well done, Laura, you have hit it out of the park. Great question." And his answer was almost as boring as the question. And as he walked off, I thought, now that's a good politician. He didn't need to do that. And he made this young woman walk away feeling 10 foot tall. And can you imagine the story she would have had, not only back at the office, but back at home that night? Not all politicians do that. And perhaps it's an obvious thing to do or an easy thing to do. But for me, that was a mark of who Perrottet was as a leader. And I was really impressed. Now, something really interesting happened over that time to Perrottet. From October 22 to February 23, his personal approval rating rose approximately 15 to 20 points, according to Freshwater Strategy. Now, that is a phenomenal increase. And even more so when you consider the context of who Perrottet was and how he was perceived when he became Premier in October 2021. And as I'm sure we all know, he was perceived in elements of society, or feared to be, a conservative Catholic. How about that, Gerard? I think he had 6 children then. He would have another with his wife Helen in office. He'd gone to a school which had an association with Opus Dei, which most people only knew through the Dan Brown films and books. And there was a fear, I think a genuine fear in society, that he would introduce a conservative religious agenda. Now, he did no such thing. But it wasn't until, I think, the very end of last year, until the start of this year, that he was really able to connect with the New South Wales community and become, to a lot of our surprise, popular. And something happened crucial in late 2022, which almost everyone was oblivious of, and that was he hired Gerard Finkelstein and Ben Winks and another gentleman in his office. Gerard was, I'm trying to get the title right. Do you know, Gerard, what his title was? It was
I think it was principal private secretary.
Principal Private Secretary.
I think that was right.
Yeah, Principal Private Secretary. It's a great title, and it just means political advisor to the Prime Minister, to Scott Morrison. Ben Wicks was one of Scott Morrison's press secretaries, and these were considered the Morrison boys. And they came in, and if you listen to some people, they took over the show. They were brought in for one really big reason, which was the Barilaro affair, which hit mid-2022. And that was devastating for the Perrottet government because with Gladys Berejiklian having stepped aside because of the ICAC inquiry, the Perrottet government was perceived in general to be non-corrupt, which is quite exceptional in New South Wales politics. And then suddenly on a Friday afternoon, I think it was, they announced to send the former Deputy Premier to a job in New York as Trade Commissioner, which he was not qualified for. Now, the Labor Party did something at this point which was pretty good. They showed that they'd learnt something from 12 years in opposition, and they just wrung every drop out of the scandal that they could. They made it last for months. It was still going on in February this year. They skillfully exploited the Barilaro affair, and Perrottet felt that his government had lost control of the narrative. They should have shut it down much faster. So he brought in some tough guys, some guys who'd been through the Morrison government. And there's a lot of criticism of the Morrison government, and a lot of that's deserved. But at the same time, these were blooded political operatives. Now, this did not go down well in all elements of the Premier's office. Some of the Premier staff felt that they literally were cut off from Perrottet, that they only got to see him at press conferences, that they were unable to give him direct advice, that they had to go through what was called derisively the Morrison boys. But perhaps more importantly, it contributed to serious tension between the Premier's office and the Treasurer's office. And there was a huge degree of animosity there. And there was a very small WhatsApp group, and Gerard Finkelstein was on it. I think Ben Wicks was on it. Matt Keane, the Treasurer, was on it. His Chief of Staff, Sean Berry, was on it. Chris Stone, the Liberal State Director, was on it. And this WhatsApp group ran the state. And it also seemed to run the Treasury. And in it, the Treasurer of New South Wales received directions from the Premier's office. And it seems to me that the Treasurer decided that early this year there was no point pushing back against this direction, and that he would do what he was told, come what may. And if things went badly, then you couldn't blame him. The Treasurer wanted to do various things in the election which he wasn't allowed to do. He had this idea to rent a beat-up bus. Now, you all have heard about the buses. Chris Minns' bus was going to run out of battery. I was on the Liberal bus when its battery ran flat, and it wasn't an electric bus. So the Treasurer had this idea of he'd rent the worst bus they could find. They would call it Labor's bus of shame, and they would drive around Sydney to places where there were projects that the Labor Party was going to cancel. And the first one was going to be an underground train station in Rozelle. Anyway, the Premier's office heard about this and they thought it was a ridiculous idea, and they told Keane not to do it. Perhaps of more significance was tension over the privatisation of assets. So what had happened was Perrottet had this form of wording which he would use to deflect questions about, are you going to sell assets? And what he would say was, we have no plans. And he'd roll us out all the time. He'd just be really emphatic about it. And he would say it enough times that we'd hope people would get bored. And there was a debate on 2GB, I think it was the 10th of February, where he was pursued hard over privatisation by Chris Minns. And Perrottet, because Minns wanted to run a privatisation scare campaign. Perrottet pushed back. Then he flew up to Taree, where the Nationals were having their launch, and he was out of the Sydney news cycle. And the next morning, Matt Keane did an interview with Patricia Cabellis, and she was asked about this. And Cabellis said, "Do you have any plans to sell Sydney Water?" And Sydney Water was particularly crucial in the whole privatisation debate because it's a monopoly. If there was a chance that it could be sold, the Labor Party could credibly run an argument that water prices would go up. And so that was sort of the pointy end of the privatisation debate. And asked about it, if he would sell it, Matt Keane departed from Perrottet's form of words and said, "No, of course not. We've got no plans to sell it." So at this point, you had the appearance of two different positions from the Premier and the Treasurer over a key policy point, and Chris Minns hammered them over it. And he hammered them so much that something like 10 days later, Perrottet felt compelled to drop his no plans formulation of wording and just rule out privatisations completely. So this made him look inconsistent. It disappointed some of his own team. It shut off what many people regarded as a pretty sensible policy option. And it didn't shut down the privatisation debate either, because then Minns just ran the argument, they're lying. And on election day, as many of you would have seen, there are very large posters hung from the fences of polling booths saying, "Liberals cut services, sell assets." So this, at the centre of government, this conflict and difficulty of coordination had real problems. And there was so much tension there that at one point, the daily talking points were distributed for all ministers and MPs in the Liberal and National parties, and Ron Finkelstein circled in red the position on asset sales and texted it to Matt Keane just to make the point very clear. Matt Keane, I'm told, didn't enjoy this, and he felt he was being sidelined. Matt Keane, from people I've spoken to, felt that he had been the one doing huge work in energy to stop the Liberal Party being wiped out in what we primarily call the teal seats. In Perrottet's office, I'm told that he felt that Matt Keane wasn't across the detail of the Treasury portfolio, and that the Premier didn't have an attack dog who could go out every day, who was across all the policies, and get stuck into the opposition, leaving the Premier to sort of rise above the fray to the extent that might be possible. So these were some of the main problems at the heart of the government, which I don't think were apparent at the time. Now, there are plenty of other reasons or problems, which I'm sure Parnell will go into in some detail. I'll just mention them very lately. The most obvious one was late candidates, poor localisation. Labor was very good at creating election material which spoke to problems or policy issues in specific seats. Most of the Liberal material, I'm told, was just statewide, which made it feel generic. You also had a whole series of retirements. I don't know how many, maybe 9 or 10, but some very long-standing Liberal MPs, particularly Jeff Lee out of Parramatta and Brad Hazzard up on the Northern Beaches, Victor Dominello and Ryde. And these are politicians who've been very good at working their electorates, and they vacated the field. You had the Barilaro debacle. At the same time, we had a very disciplined and well-oiled Labor campaign. They they borrowed from the Albanese playbook, which is they presented themselves as a low-risk, safe option. Chris Minns was very disciplined, and you could tell that he had changed the rules of politics a bit when he started refusing to call for anyone to resign. So I'm not aware of Chris Minns calling for any minister's resignation. Now, usually these calls are a dime a dozen, they happen all the time. But Minns said no, he never said, even when the Liberal Party fell into minority government and even further minority government, he didn't say let's have an election now. He was always said let's have an election, the time's appropriate. He would back the government on certain policies. So you had Minns very self-consciously presenting himself as unthreatening and an unthreatening centrist. And he promised not to spend too much. And so he wasn't going to be, or at least on his list, these release policies, he wasn't presenting a big spending agenda. And he carried himself in a pretty unthreatening way. He would be friendly to Perrottet. He would not shout. He wasn't seen as erratic. And I noticed on election night when he won, there was a camera outside his house, and he got into the car, and it was a pretty intense moment. And he got into the front seat, and there were two women behind him. I assume one was his wife and someone else was a friend or relative. And they were grinning from ear to ear. You could just tell how excited they were. But Minns wouldn't smile. You could tell he was restraining himself because he didn't want to look like a grinning person who was really pleased with himself. He wanted to look like a sober, responsible man who was preparing for the responsibilities of office. And it was that kind of discipline that I really respected, and I think was an example of why he was so effective as an opposition leader. But ultimately, I think a lot of what I spoke about tonight is sort of background noise. It's very interesting, but it's not as important as the fundamental reason I think we had a change in government, which was after 12 years' time, I think people in New South Wales felt this government was tired, and they felt that it would be healthy for the state and for democracy to have a new government have a shot. And I think that's possibly one of the beauties of democracy, which is they keep political parties on their toes and they throw them out occasionally, maybe sometimes when they don't necessarily deserve it. But I think it's probably healthy for democracy overall. So thank you very much, and I'll let Parnell speak.
Thanks, Aaron. So, Parnell McGuinness.
Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight, and thank you, Gerard and Anne, so much for having me again. I'd like to pick up on that theme. You ended at a perfect place once again on the healthy democracy, because that's very much what I'm talking about in this. You might have seen today that the incoming Treasurer, Daniel Mookie, has kept with tradition beautifully. He's discovered a budget black hole left to him by his predecessor in the Liberal government. And he knows his lines by heart. So he says he wants to pay down New South Wales debt and audit the programs of the last 12 years to remove waste and overruns. And hearing those words is just so reassuring. It's as reassuring almost as it's unlikely. The previous government's budget black hole is always a comforting little set piece, because it reminds us that when democracy works properly, it's essentially a rotation between tune-up crews tasked with fixing the inevitable failures of the complex and colossal machinery of government. And to my mind, the recent New South Wales election has revealed New South Wales to be probably the most functional and democratically healthy of Australia's states. It was not only was Dominic Perrottet's speech as outgoing Premier positively uplifting, the campaign itself, despite the tactics, but that's campaigning, was civil, and it was focused on policy rather than personality. Now, you could say, of course, that that's because the candidates were so similar. But I say if that's what it takes to restore policy focus to the political circus, then bring out the clones. So the key policy differences headlining the election as it drew to a close were privatisation of state assets, capping tolls, which are of course related to the privatisation of road assets, and pay rises for government employees, health and emergency workers, of course, not bureaucrats who've been fired and reshuffled in a very destabilising move. And the key policy differences, and each of those has, of course, its benefits and its drawbacks. The former being that they sound great, and the latter being that they need to be paid for. But I'm all ears on how the Labor government plans to do that, as well as confident that if they plan to do it in a way that's unpalatable to voters, because the outgoing government has left themselves in a healthy place, a correction can quickly be made in the return of an alternative governing team. And that's because the New South Wales Liberal government lost the state election and it didn't lose its dignity. So how does this New South Wales Liberal loss compare to other Liberal losses nationally? Well, the obvious comparison is, of course, the federal Liberal loss. At the 2022 federal election, the nation was determined to get rid of a do-nothing government led by a Prime Minister who'd begun to give voters the icks by slavishly following the polls, until those polls turned on him and told him to stop being such a stalker. In the lead up to the election, the 10-year-old federal government was clean out of ideas, or often, unfortunately, it seemed too chicken to implement them. Moreover, the focus of the Liberal Party had shifted from thinking of ways to make people's lives better to thinking of ways that they could prosecute minuscule internecine squabbles in a way that would cause maximal public humiliation, usually to themselves. That famously resulted in the candidate pre-selection being blocked to protect incumbent New South Wales power broker Alex Hawke. When pre-selections did go ahead, factional deals often ensured a candidate handpicked by the party not to appeal to the electorate. In this combination of personality-based antipathy and organisational self-harm, if that wasn't enough to condemn the Liberal Party federally to at least 2 terms in the wilderness, it will be a miracle by the Queensland copper. The other comparative loss is the failure, of course, of the Victorian Liberal Party to provide an alternative to a Premier of the Victorian Liberal Party, to provide an alternative to a Premier who literally locked up his citizens, ran his state into so much unnecessary debt that he's now defunding vital services, and let his police force run around like an old-style Queensland copper, not the one who's in charge with the opposition. The New South Wales Liberal government didn't lose in the same spectacular, inexplicable or humiliating fashion of either of those losses. In fact, despite scandals by the inevitable scumbags and hucksters who seem to plague government at all levels, but really come into their own at the zoning and phoning echelons, the New South Wales Liberal government managed to remain doggedly focused on coming up with good policy, not just good property development. Indeed, one of the chief criticisms that might be made of the Berejiklian Perrottet government was that it didn't stand up for property developers enough. And honestly, I wasn't thinking of you when I wrote this. But it comprehensively lost the war against inner city suburbanites, bravely fighting off an invasion of grandchildren into their enclaves by opposing mid-rise accommodation within working distance of the CBD. All in all, the policy program of the New South Wales Liberal government didn't suffer from the same ideas drought or cowardice, though, which brought down its federal counterpart. Instead of running out of ideas, what the New South Wales Liberals ran out of was demographic advantage. An analysis of the seats which the Liberals lost in the March election paints a clear picture of a demographic loss. In 4 cases, Parramatta, Riverstone, South Coast and Wakehurst, new candidates were unable to retain the seats of retiring incumbents. In 3 others, Camden, East Hills and Wallandilly, a woman with strong local connections won the seat. And in 2 of those, the opponent was a male candidate, while in East Hills, a traditional Labor seat, swapped back from a Liberal woman to a Labor woman, again with deep and long-term local ties. Like at a federal level, the Liberal Party lost because between the member base and the factions, it found itself unable to source and pre-select candidates who would appeal to voters. And now the party finds itself headless and struggling to find within itself the right leader to correct course. But so much for what happened to the Liberals. what happens to New South Wales from here? Much like federally, the New South Wales Labor Party ran a cautious and conservative campaign. Before the election, Labor MPs were at pains to emphasise their conservative religious values that connect them with the Western Sydney constituencies that they consider crucial to electoral success. So could we expect more of the same? Well, the good work of that the Liberals did on establishing an evidence base for policy might be adopted by the Labor Party, and it wouldn't be the worst thing they could do. Using those ideas would save them from an evidence-based attack by the opposition once it regathers. In addition, it's got a lot of good ideas of its own. And of course, there's that necessary review of waste and graft and the graft that sneaks up on any government. But what happens next to Labor will depend heavily on the independence and the minority government relies on for supply. Sydney MP Alex Greenwich, Lake Macquarie MP Greg Piper and Wagga Wagga MP Joe Gurr are holding the balance, and what they do next will be critical. Alex Greenwich we already know. He's introduced his new equality bill, and that's his signature policy for this term. It follows the voluntary assisted dying bill, which he successfully traded through New South Wales Parliament, despite opposition from some Labor MPs. Greenwich says the bill will address all legislative barriers to LGBTIQA+ health and wellbeing. This bill will allow people to change their gender on their birth certificate, not such a success in Scotland recently, and on other state documentation without transitioning surgically. It'll introduce a consent model similar to the ACTs for medical procedures on people born with intersex variations and remove targeted discrimination, including in schools, by which we can understand undermining the ability of religious schools to take decisions on staffing consistent with their faith doctrines. It will also ban conversion practices, by which Greenwich means keeping parents or others out of the proposal to give a minor gender transition hormones. This agenda might not be one that Minns favours. In fact, he's shown signs that that's not what he's interested in. But it will be popular with some Labor ministers and some of the base. Greenwich showed that he could drag the Liberal government under Conservative Dom Perrottet to the left. If he drags the Labor government to the left, Sydney might suddenly feel a lot closer to Victoria. But whether this happens will in part depend on how well the Liberal Party reconstitutes. The corrective, if you believe there needs to be one, is of course that great weapon of voters, a functional democracy. The New South Wales Liberal Party, having been left in a good position, just needs the right candidates to put it back in the fray. And again, to come back to what we were talking about at the beginning, it's healthy elections, which are always the wonderful corrective in our democratic tradition, and provide an opportunity for our institutions to be cleaned up. I love a little post-election pantomime, and I believe Minns and Mookie's is particularly wholesome because it reminds us that really we're defending something that we all have deeply in common, which is the desire for well-functioning institutions that reflect the best of us at all times.
Well, if you just come up here again, both you, Aaron, you come here. Many thanks to both of you. So thanks for a very good analysis of New South Wales, and we end up, as you know, with a minority Labor government. Would you like to both make a comment on the Aston by-election? As we're looking at, and as you come out of this election, New South Wales is not too bad for the coalition. Queensland's probably not too bad as well. Other parts of the country are not so good, you would think, but give us a brief comment with the emphasis on brief.
And Parnell's view than mine.
Just talk. Just come back and talk.
Yeah, I think it was a reflection partly on Dutton still struggling to find his popularity. I also do think that there is federally a bit of a hangover effect from Morrison, which hasn't washed out. Perrottet did an amazing job turning that around in New South Wales. He managed to sort of expunge that feeling of being associated with Morrison, and that was part of turning him around, along with the children in every photo shoot. That was genius. But back on Aston, really I feel like that was a finishing off of a federal trend rather than a comment on something that we can expect going forward.
Perrottet did so well. Should he have stepped down?
Well, he didn't lose hugely. He, I mean, you know,
Yeah,
it was
I agree, but should he have stepped down, do you think?
stepped down as premier.
As
Should he?
leader,
Oh,
yeah.
should he have stayed as leader? Sorry. Look, I understand why he hasn't. Let me put it that way. I think that Perrottet has shown the ability to lead many, many things by his time as premier, and he will have some great job offers to go to.
There's a question. Yeah.
I'm in Wentworth and Vaucluse. Obviously, we went to a Teal federally, but the Liberal candidate had absolutely no trouble in the Vaucluse. Can we explain why the Teals is not reflected in the state as it was federally?
Well, as a voter in Vaucluse, you might have a better idea than us. But I think if you spoke to Matt Keane, you would say it was because of him. Okay, so and they did. The Perrottet government did do a lot of Teal-like, I guess, policies. Also, you've got optional preferential voting. But we've been trained so well, 80% of people in the state allocate their preferences anyway. The Teals only got one seat, that was Wallandilly, although there was a Teal-like candidate, Michael Regan, up in Brad Hazard's old seat. So it was a failure for the Teals, and it raises the question as to whether 2022 was the high point for Simon Holmes' Court's movement. And now that, I guess, the federal government are moving aggressively towards net zero, mind you, Morrison's government embraced it too, you could perhaps, you could mount the case that in voters' minds, the policy pressure for that has been relieved. And so there is less obvious reason to vote Teal. But we'll see.
Want to make a comment, Parnell?
Yeah, I think it's really simple. Allegra Spender has shown that she's basically a Liberal, and I think that area votes Liberal, but just didn't like the Liberal Party that was on offer under Scott Morrison. I think that Allegra Spender will hold it for a very long time now because she's doing really well on the sort of economic front. I think she's appealing in many ways to the area. So she's consolidating her position, but Kelly in the state election, also has many Allegra-like qualities.
Kelly's second name is...
Kelly Sloan.
Kelly Sloan, yeah.
Quick question on the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party did extremely poorly amongst the under 35s. What have they got to do to win back that particular market? Because at this point in time, they're just not cool.
So I think you've hit the nail on the head that this is the Liberal Party's greatest weakness and biggest problem, which is young people have turned against the party, or those young people who are open to voting for it are just running a mile. And I've written this a couple of times, but at the end of the 22 federal election, Crosby Textor did a survey, and they said they asked people, do you think that the Liberal Party does not reflect the aspirations of modern Australia? And 67% of respondents agreed. Okay, so clearly there's a perception that the Liberal Party represents a bygone conservative era. And the solution is not simple, it's not obvious, but there's one really, really important component to it, and that's property prices. Okay, young people today, particularly in the inner cities, particularly in the Teal seats, they're frozen out of the property market. And so the property boom that we've all experienced in our lifetimes, and which is, let's be honest, enriched an older generation of Australians, particularly the baby boomers, has disenfranchised economically so many young Australians, and it is exacerbating income inequality in this country. And when people say, well, what's the solution to win back the Teal seats? And the solution is you build Mirvac apartments in Mossman and Hunters Hill, in Bondi Beach, because property owners are more likely to be interested in values of capitalism.
I think I agree on the property part, but I would say that there is a simpler solution also, and that is that I don't think the Liberal Party at the moment talks very well about what its values are. In fact, I'm not even sure that a lot of the people in the Liberal Party know what liberal values are. So I think really that is the starting point, is to understand what classical liberalism actually means, what conservatism actually means. That is the first part of becoming confident in being able to define yourself and wanting to define yourself that way. And of course, the second part of it, which comes out of that when people understand what it means, is feeling comfortable defining yourself like that in polite company. So at the moment, young people would never go to a party and say, oh yeah, I'm in the Liberal Party. I mean, unless they're crackpots like some that work for me. No, delightful crackpots. But you know, it is, and that is because there is really a huge muddiness around what anything like that means. But if you bring it back to classical liberal values have a lot of appeal cross-generationally if you really explain them well.
I just make a comment on East Hills. Wendy Lindsay, local candidate, she lost by about whatever the number of thousand of votes.
Yeah.
But I think one of the critical issues there was the boundary changes, which were significant. In my view, before the election started, she was 3,000 votes behind. And I think principally she's a very popular candidate, but the boundary changes overwhelmed her.
And I think that was
You might just explain East Hills. Just tell us where it is. Or where?
East Hills is around Reesby, Panania, Padstow, extending out now to New Goona and the outer suburbs. So there's been substantial changes.
And the way I remember it, that was a woman with a female Labor challenger, wasn't it?
The current member who's just been elected is a director of the Reesby Workers Club.
That's right. A great club, Ben.
But technically doesn't live within the electorate.
Yep.
Okay. All right. We got a question down the back. Yeah. Okay.
Reading the tea leaves, who do you see as being the next leader of the opposition?
That's yours.
The word on the street seems to be Mark Speakman. The word on the street is that is he the right guy given his age? So I don't want to be ageist, but I think he's 62. So the next election he'll be 66. Minns will be 52. It may be a difficult comparison for a Liberal Party, which will presumably wanting to be presenting itself as a fresh face. The funniest thing is, though, I was talking to someone who would know about this, and they'd said if Stuart Ayres had held Parramatta, and I think he had like a 2.5-3% swing against him, which is pretty good, that Stuart Ayres probably would have been leader.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's funny that because I'd always had a perception of Stuart Ayres as being, a bit of a dill. And I think that was unfair of mine, and I think that was just someone who just didn't know the man, and I was probably judging him on an unfair basis. But he was sort of unlucky to lose because there was some negotiations over preference swaps down there, which could have changed things but didn't.
I've got a question to you, Aaron, on the Zoom. Do you think the introduction of the Morrison gang helped or hindered the New South Wales government's campaign?
Well, that's just such a great question, and I don't know the answer. And there's really strong views within the government about that. And clearly there was a lot of personal animosity created by the arrival of these guys because they were such strong personalities and they had really strong views about how Perrottet should operate. And one of the things is that Perrottet likes to tell jokes. So he'd go to a press conference, he'd be serious, and he'd say his lines of the day. And so what the idea of these press conferences is to get 5-second quote on television that night. But you have to go in a period of press conference that might go from anything from 10 minutes to 25 minutes. And so that requires you to be quite boring and not answer the questions and not give information to people like me. Because if you do, there is a chance that the televisions will not use the quotes you want them to use. And Dominic Perrottet likes joking around. And so he would see if someone, a journalist would ask me a question, he'd say, "Oh, Steve-o, what a great question, what do you think?" And he'd love to do, that was just the nature of who he was. And it made him a fun guy. And they basically said, "Stop it. Okay, you've got to be disciplined. You've got to be boring. Here's your lines. Stick to them." And it's hard to argue against that. But even people on Paradise staff didn't like it. And people on Keen staff hated it.
Okay, so there's a question down here.
Hi, I'm interested in the cool factor, which you mentioned a little while ago. When I was a young trainee nurse in the early 60s, it was very cool to be Liberal. To be Labor was definitely uncool. So what has changed in the last 40 years?
I think Parnell's probably better answering that than I am.
She's the cool one.
She is the cool one.
Well, I don't have the memory span, but I would say that something that has happened, I think at the time, Labor was perhaps quite dominant and the unions were quite dominant, and there was something appealing and possibly in tune with the times about the individualism and small L liberalism that goes along with the Liberal Party, which it potentially was a bit more at that time following Menzies and his platform. As I say, I think losing focus can, switches things around, and I think that Labor picked up a whole bunch of other topics, even as the unions sort of fell back and are a core plank but aren't so dominant in society. They became a representation of something else and better at becoming a rallying point, which the Liberal Party just doesn't do that side of things very well anymore.
Okay, there's a question there.
You mentioned the Equality Act and then how the member for whatever the seat is, the independent, may well use it to push through a bill. But if you've got a minority government, as you do in the Senate, it would be very easy to defeat that bill by the Liberals just voting with the government. So what I'm wondering is, to overcome the power of the independents, do you see a new kind of parliament working where on specific issues they may behave like they do in the Senate and work together? Is that a possibility? It's interesting on the Equality Act because right at the moment in Britain, Sunak is trying to go the opposite way. He's going to redefine women to biological women, and they're going to reform the Equality Act. So in other words, we're behind. But I could see a situation like that where if enough members of the Parliament don't think it's a good move, all they have to do is vote together.
Okay, let's start with Parnell. Parnell, come up here.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. They could do that. The question is, will they do that? And I think that that's probably unlikely because while, as much as Minns and various other ministers before the election might have sort of emphasised their conservatism, there is, of course, a very progressive wing in the Labor Party that would likely not be terribly happy about pushing back against this bill. So we will see how things evolve internationally. I mean, it will, of course, depend what happens in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon has obviously stepped back, but to that bill there, and how things evolve around the world for Labor-leaning parties. I don't think what Rishi Sunak does will influence the Labor Party in New South Wales. But so that's what will make a difference. And possibly, it's not about cancelling the whole bill, it's possibly about moderating it so that it's so that there are sensible checks involved.
I don't think I can add much more to it.
I don't think just on the bill, generally, economics, whatever, different things where independents want to push for an extreme. They don't have to do it.
We'll see. Too hard.
I have a Zoom question here which sort of relates to that. So there's a question that says that to either of you, or both of you, the upper house appears to be split 21 notionally left of centre, 21 notionally right of centre. Labor may need to offer the upper house presidency to an enemy, in inverted commas, from the right of centre? What are the prospects of Labor's agenda for the coming term getting through the upper house?
Another great question from Zoom. Well, I can share with you an anecdote about the upper house, which I don't think has been made public before. Some of you might know Mark Latham resigned so he could run again, and 8-year terms. And so he was replaced by the One Nation list. And so the whole idea was he thought if on the basis of his personal popularity, he could get 2 seats in the upper house. So he'd have 4, which would be a pretty powerful position. Liberal Party wanted to do a preference swap with him. And they offered to put him second on the upper house ticket, One Nation second, in some seats, in return for preferences, maybe even in Penrith, which might have saved Stuart Ayres. Because remember, there was a lot of talk about a One Nation surge this election. I'm told the deal was going to happen until very late in the piece, and Mark Latham said no, because he thought he was going to win 2 seats. So the Liberals went to the Liberal Democrats and they said, hey, we'll put you second if you don't run in any lower house seats. Now, the problem is the Liberal Democrats, some voters confuse them for the Liberal Party, so it can cost them a point or 2. Apparently, the Liberal Democrats thought for about 5 seconds and they said, yeah, we'll do that. And as a result, John Ruddock got elected, former Liberal member, now Liberal Democrat, and One Latham got 1 seat, his own. So I think that's a lesson for hubris. And if Latham won that, he would have been even more powerful.
So as to his role in the current upper house, in the new upper house, will he have much of a role?
Who?
Latham.
Well, 3 seats, of course he will. But let's just see. You know, there is the animal welfare people too, and you know, Ruddock's a real libertarian. You could see him voting with Labor plenty of times, and the farmers, the shooters, farmers, and fishers are pretty pragmatic too. Hard to predict.
No, he's right. No.
I was going to say that look, the bank of Mum and Dad in Mossman and Vaucluse and places like that, it's bigger than the Commonwealth. And I think all those young people should run home for a while and talk to Mum and Dad.
Take us a comment.
I think the Commonwealth Bank could be pretty threatened by that, I think. Yeah, so we got...
Can I add a question?
Yeah.
Some of the young kids that live in the inner city for the university and have to rent it's got into their lexicon that the government should actually subsidise them to be able to live there. I mean, to what extent is this housing crisis also part of middle-class kids not wanting to move anywhere other than where they're used to being? I mean, there's an element of truth in that.
You're saying it's seen as a human rights breach that they can't afford terraces in Newtown.
Parramatta, I mean, to pay them to live in
Look, I think. Look, the thing is here, Anne, is that you've got a council system in Sydney which is essentially set up to block out outsiders. You know, what is Mossman's probably growing maybe 200 dwellings a year. You know, they've got a national park, they've got a beach, they've got a zoo. You know, we've been fighting for them to get a Woolworths, and we finally succeeded. You know, a lot of spilt ink to get it. And so why shouldn't they be allowed to have Meriton apartments? Why shouldn't the middle class people, perhaps even, God forbid, non-Anglo-Saxon Australians, you know, who want to be able to go to the zoo with their kids on the weekend, be allowed to live in affordable housing in Mossman? Why not?
Parnell, you got a comment on that?
I
It'll be very expensive.
Couldn't agree more. Maybe they don't want their grandchildren too close. I couldn't agree more. I've just come back from a trip to Singapore and Vietnam, and you know, it's of course really striking how well Singapore, for instance, has dealt with that by keeping a lot of the heritage, old style feel of the streets, but building mid-rise around that. And similarly in Vietnam, in Saigon, they've managed that sort of growth around key arteries really, really well. And I've always found it shocking that I can walk from the CBD to my house, which is now in Darlinghurst, so 20-minute walk up the road, and I go from sky-rise buildings to two-storey. I mean, it is outrageous, really, that there aren't more mid-rise around there.
We're doing our bit in North Sydney.
Yeah.
There's a question here. You've got to be brief. Okay, we're getting near the end.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the Zoom conference question that took my question about ScoMo's advisors and their influence. So, in his valedictory speech, Rob Stokes described Dom Perrottet, which I can say, given that I don't think he will be leader because of the damage of his relatives and so forth and the media attention. Rob Stokes described Gladys as a workhorse, Mike Baird as a thoroughbred, and therefore Dom Perrottet could best be described as a stallion, however undisciplined. Do you agree?
Oh, it's a great line. I wish I'd had that. I could use that in my speech. I think this might be a good moment to sort of sum up. This election and this government has shown us something really profound, which is there are great leaders on both sides. Changes in governments are healthy. Huge majorities are not. But also, good government can be rewarded up to a point. Mike Baird did something quite courageous, did a couple of things quite courageous, but he went and sold what they call the poles and wires, and he knew Australians would be so attached to pieces of timber and the wires strung between them. But they were, and he lost seats over it, and as a result, I think he got $11 million, which he could put into infrastructure. Perrottet sold WestConnex, it's a road tunnel. These politicians acted on principle for the benefit of the country. Perrottet opened us quite quickly after COVID. Gladys Berejiklian fought day after day, worked hard and hard, for the benefit of the state. She didn't have, I didn't think she had a clear vision. I don't think she was particularly ideological, but you couldn't fault her for her commitment and diligence, and perhaps a bit of humility too. Yeah. And so I think in these people, and I'm sure they're just as good people on the Labor side, we just haven't had them in government, so now haven't been able to show that, so I'm not trying to make a partisan point here. But I would say if you want to go home with any strong feeling tonight, which is a sense of optimism about political leadership in this country, okay? Because there is huge sense, I think, of anger and turmoil and conflict. But the Premier of New South Wales was able to stand up on election night, having lost not that badly, and give an incredibly magnanimous speech, okay? Setting an example, I think, for politics across the country. So I think, if anything, we can take hope, we can take good heart from what's happened.
Another comment from Parnell?
I couldn't say it better. I think that's a perfect sum up. I think that this new government coming in, I have as much optimism for as I thought the previous government deserved to stay on, but this new government deserved to win. So, it comes down to policy and ideas from here, and I think there are plenty on both sides in this case, and New South Wales is the winner out of that.
Okay, well, I think that's a very good moment on which to finish. We've had quite a fascinating account of what the New South Wales election and its implications, with a bit of a look at other parts of Australia as well. And it's great to have a bit of optimism around, actually. So I think we all need it. So well done, Parnell.
Thank you.
Well done, Alan.